Coming up, with poll trackers showing an ever-increasing majority realising that Brexit was a mistake, a new poll this week shows that for the very first time, even Conservative voters think the cost of Brexit outweighs its benefits. It's been a bitter awakening for every Leave voter who was hoodwinked by the likes of Boris Johnson, Nigel Farrage and Jacob Rees-Mogg into voting against their own interests. Yet still, the two main political parties show no signs of retreating from a Make Brexit Work policy when a majority of the electorate now realises that Brexit can't work. Stay tuned for a summary of where we are right now on Brexit.
If you enjoy watching the Truth to Power channel, I'd really appreciate it if you'd help me out by hitting the like button and especially by sharing a link to this video on your social media platforms.
Although it won't come as news to regular viewers of this channel, since Brexit, the British pound has plummeted, losing around 20% of its value against both the US dollar and the euro. As a result, imports have become more expensive, which in turn has fueled inflation. And sure, other countries are also struggling with currency devaluation and inflation, but the UK is hit particularly hard with continuing double-digit inflation. This economic weakness has also had an impact on tax revenues for the government coffers. Brexit has meant a £40 billion annual reduction in tax generation and has pushed Rishi Sunak and his Chancellor Jeremy Hunt into austerity-style savings as a result. But even as the government pushes relentlessly to achieve these savings, the country is on its knees, desperate for investment in infrastructure, in the National Health Service, in social care and in schools. It feels like Brexit is just one more reason for government cuts. Many Brexitists dreamed of UK industry blossoming outside of the EU, but 2 years on from Brexit, investment has plummeted due to a lack of international interest in the British economy. Brexitists also dreamed of a large number of free trade agreements after Brexit. Global Britain, they called it. What a joke. There have only been substantial new trade agreements with Australia and New Zealand, and they are of close to zero importance, adding respectively 0.1% and 0.03% to Britain's economic output over the long term, while delivering a hammer blow to British farming.
Well, despite the claim by Anne-Marie Trevelyan, the NSVU President Minette Batters has reacted angrily to this deal. She says the announcement of this trade deal with New Zealand, coupled with the Australia deal signed earlier this year, means we'll be opening our doors to significant extra volumes of imported food, whether or not produced to our own high standards, while securing almost nothing in return for UK farmers. And she says we should all be worried there could be a huge downside to these deals, especially for sectors such as dairy, red meat and horticulture.
Other so-called new deals were just rollovers from the deals we had within the EU, just at slightly less favourable rates in most cases. The fact is, Brexit has brought only disadvantages. This is particularly evident when it comes to exports. You would think that British exports would have actually increased since Brexit. The pound has fallen so much that British goods are significantly cheaper on world markets. But exports are just not getting off the ground, partly because trade with our biggest trading partner, the EU, has become so much more difficult as a result of Brexit. The EU was and is Britain's largest trading partner, so of course it's no surprise that this is another so-called Brexit benefit that has failed to materialise. British companies now have to fill out a mass of customs documents if they want to export their goods to Europe. Small and medium-sized companies in particular are completely overwhelmed. They either gave up completely or set up subsidiaries within the EU to avoid customs problems, with the subsequent loss of both jobs and economic activity in the UK. In this context, it's no surprise that there's a growing recognition amongst the electorate that Brexit was a mistake. But despite the change of heart evidenced by poll after poll, the new will of the people, to coin a phrase, has not had any political consequences as yet. Keir Starmer's Labour Party prefers to avoid the issue of Brexit so as not to alienate voters in the now marginal seats in the Northern Red Wall. And the governing Tories show no signs of pragmatism in their commitment to maintain the current failing Brexit arrangements. Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt were recently said to have sounded out the parliamentary Tory party on the idea of negotiating a new deal with the EU along the lines of the Swiss model. Switzerland is not in the EU, but is allowed to participate in the internal market without paying a significant amount into the EU coffers. A similar deal for the UK would solve many of the problems caused by Brexit. Rejoining the single market would get rid of the current non-tariff barriers, the Brexit red tape, and allow exports to return to pre-Brexit levels. However, Sunak and Hunt had to give up their idea when the European Research Group of Tory MPs on the right wing of the party immediately threatened a revolt. For them, any Swiss-style agreement would be unacceptable because for them, it's not about the economy, investment, trade, or even standards of living. Most of them have substantial financial holdings offshore, unaffected by Britain's demise. No, for them it's about some nebulous idea of sovereignty, the idea of a glorious, world-beating Britain standing in splendid isolation, turning to its old empire for new trade deals and new markets. All complete bollocks, of course. But the Swiss model would mean having to adopt EU regulations again because the internal market can only work if all participants adhere to the same rules. And in any case, the EU doesn't want to repeat the Swiss model. They believe that if they sold off internal market access to the UK, then other countries might consider leaving the EU to save on membership contributions and then aim to rejoin the single market through the same Swiss model. Although it doesn't seem very likely, it appears that such concerns on behalf of the EU are misplaced because as the rest of Europe has watched in horror at how Brexit has affected the British economy, it's not surprising to see that support for leaving the EU has fallen significantly in countries right across the bloc. The latest European Social Survey found that ever since the Brexit referendum, respondents were less likely to vote leave in every EU member state for which data was available. Mathieu Gallard, research director of the leading French polling firm Ipsos, which regularly conducts surveys of European opinion, said the European Social Survey numbers reflected a veritable collapse in support for leaving the EU in several countries. He added that the fall in support for a leave vote most likely stemmed from a cumulative effect, combining the EU's attitude towards the various crises of recent years, the radical right's moderation on the subject of leaving the EU, and the many vicissitudes of Brexit. The view from the continent is clear. Brexit has been a disaster for Britain, even if our own political leaders won't acknowledge it. The Conservatives appear to be wedded to their Brexit, and Keir Starmer has ruled out rejoining the EU single market if Labour wins power. But interestingly, the Labour politician with the most power at the moment is the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. He is actually in power. And in a speech this week, he attacked the government's denial of the immense damage that Brexit is doing and called for a shift to greater alignment with Europe. The Labour mayor said that the consequences of leaving the EU can't be airbrushed out of history or the consequences washed away, adding, "After 2 years of denial and avoidance, we must now confront the hard truth. Brexit isn't working. It's weakened our economy, fractured our union, and diminished our reputation." While Sadiq Khan's criticism is aimed at the government, it will also be seen as a swipe at the recent harder stance on Brexit taken by his own party leader, with Starmer employing phrases like "Make Brexit Work" and "Take back control" in the last few weeks, and reiterating his belief that the UK will never again join the single market, the customs union, or full EU membership. Meanwhile, we have the full-on Brexitist Tory government hell-bent on bringing in their retained EU law bill, intended to strip thousands of EU laws out of British legislation to fulfil the Brexitist agenda of deregulation, which will have a massive and intended impact on consumer rights, workers' rights and environmental protections, shifting the power balance in this country further away from consumers, workers and citizens and giving more power to the corporations, the Americanisation of British society. You get the feeling that Brexit is going to get one hell of a lot worse in 2023. The government's stated policy on Brexit is still that the British people set out their view back in 2016 and the government is busy enacting. 7 years later, the British people have a very different view, which the government is most certainly not enacting. Sir Anton Muscatelli, economist and principal of Glasgow University, has said that we may have to wait several years until the political heat goes out of Brexit, and that only then can we have a hard-headed look at how to build a new relationship with the European Union that repairs some of the damage and works for both sides. But until more of our political leaders start to acknowledge the damage caused by Brexit, that reckoning still seems a very long way off.